The Stranger in the Woods. Sarah had always loved hiking. There was something about being in nature that made her feel alive, free from the stress of her everyday life. So when her friend invited her on a weekend camping trip in the woods, she jumped at the chance. The two friends set up their tent in a clearing and spent the day exploring the woods. As the sun began to set, they started a campfire and settled in for the night. As they were roasting marshmallows over the fire, they heard a rustling in the bushes. At first, they assumed it was an animal, but as the noise got louder, they became more and more uneasy. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the woods. It was a man, tall and thin, with long hair and a scraggly beard. He looked disheveled and wild, and the friends could see that he was carrying a large backpack. The man didn't say anything, but simply stood there, staring at them with wild eyes. Sarah and her friend tried to ignore him, hoping that he would go away, but the man stayed put, his gaze never leaving them. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally spoke. "Can I join you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah and her friend exchanged a look, unsure of what to do. They didn't know this man, and he seemed unstable. But they also didn't want to be rude or hurtful. After a moment of hesitation, they reluctantly agreed to let him stay. The man settled down by the fire, still silent, but with a strange energy emanating from him. As the night wore on, Sarah and her friend became more and more uncomfortable. The man didn't say anything, but his presence was oppressive, like a dark cloud hanging over them. Finally, Sarah's friend couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her backpack and announced that she was going to find a different spot to camp. Sarah hesitated, torn between her loyalty to her friend and her fear of the stranger in the woods. In the end, she decided to stay. She didn't want to leave the campfire unattended, and she didn't want to be alone in the woods with the strange man. As her friend walked off into the night, Sarah tried to make small talk with the man, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, Sarah crawled into her tent and tried to sleep. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the stranger was still out there, lurking in the darkness. In the middle of the night, she woke up to a sound outside her tent. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, as the footsteps grew closer and closer. Suddenly, the tent flap was pulled back, and the stranger's wild eyes were staring at her from the darkness. Sarah screamed, scrambling to get out of her sleeping bag and run. But the man was too fast, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her towards him. She fought back with everything she had, but the man was too strong. He pinned her to the ground, his eyes burning with a strange, manic energy. As he leaned in, Sarah could smell the stench of sweat and dirt on his skin. She closed her eyes, praying for it to be over, but the man suddenly froze. His grip on her loosened, and he stumbled backwards, collapsing on the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet, not knowing what had happened. As she looked down at the stranger, she saw that he had a strange, otherworldly mark on his forehead, glowing with a faint blue light. And then, there was a blinding flash of light, and Sarah felt herself being lifted off the ground. She screamed, thinking that she was being abducted by aliens, but as she opened her eyes, she saw something even more strange. The stranger was gone, and in his place stood a shimmering, translucent figure, glowing with a brilliant blue light. It looked like a creature from another world, with tentacles and strange appendages writhing and moving in the air. Sarah tried to run, but the creature held her in place with a powerful force field. She watched in horror as the creature began to speak, its voice echoing through the woods. "You have encountered a being from another world," it said. "I have taken the form of the stranger to observe your species. But now, it is time for me to depart." And with that, the creature disappeared in a blinding flash of light, leaving Sarah alone in the woods, shaking and terrified. She didn't know what to make of what had happened. Had she just witnessed an alien encounter? Or was it all a hallucination, brought on by fear and exhaustion? She stumbled back to the campfire, where her friend was waiting. When she told her what had happened, her friend was skeptical, dismissing it as a nightmare. But Sarah knew what she had seen. She knew that the stranger in the woods had been more than just a man. He had been a portal to another world, a doorway to a reality beyond her wildest imagination. From that day forward, Sarah was never the same. She had witnessed something that had shaken her to her core, and she knew that she would never be able to forget it. The stranger in the woods had been her glimpse into a world beyond her own, a world of mysteries and wonders that she could barely comprehend. And even though she knew that she would never fully understand what had happened, she was grateful for the experience. It had opened her eyes to a new world, a world that she knew was out there, waiting to be explored. The possessed phone. Evelyn had always been fascinated by the occult. She spent hours scouring the internet for stories about ghosts, demons, and other supernatural phenomena. So when she stumbled upon a website selling haunted items, she couldn't resist. She quickly placed an order for a vintage rotary phone that was said to be possessed by a malevolent spirit. When the phone arrived, Evelyn was thrilled. She eagerly plugged it in and waited for it to ring. But when it did, she was met with a chilling voice on the other end. "Hello, Evelyn," the voice hissed. "I've been waiting for you." Evelyn was terrified, but she couldn't bring herself to disconnect the call. She listened as the voice spoke to her in a language she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. The spirit was angry and wanted revenge. Over the next few days, Evelyn started to experience strange occurrences. The phone would ring at odd hours of the night, even when it wasn't plugged in. She would hear strange whispers and footsteps in her empty apartment. And worst of all, she began having horrific nightmares that left her screaming in terror. Desperate for answers, Evelyn contacted a psychic medium who specialized in dealing with haunted objects. The medium came to her apartment and immediately sensed the presence of a malevolent entity. She told Evelyn that the spirit was angry and wanted revenge for being trapped in the phone. The medium tried to communicate with the spirit, but it refused to cooperate. It seemed determined to torment Evelyn and make her life a living hell. Evelyn was at her wit's end. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, and she was constantly on edge. She knew she had to do something before the spirit drove her insane. One night, as she was lying in bed, the phone rang again. She hesitated for a moment, but then she picked it up. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" The spirit's voice was low and menacing. "I want you to suffer," it said. "I want you to feel the pain that I felt when I was trapped in this phone. And I won't stop until I get what I want." Evelyn felt a surge of anger. She refused to be a victim anymore. She hung up the phone and marched over to her closet. She grabbed a hammer and marched back to the phone. With a fierce determination, Evelyn smashed the phone to pieces. The room was filled with a shower of sparks as the phone exploded into fragments. Evelyn stood there, panting and sweating, as she watched the smoke clear. For a moment, there was silence. And then, to her horror, the fragments of the phone began to move on their own. They twisted and turned, forming a shape that Evelyn recognized all too well. It was the shape of a human figure, hovering in midair. And it was coming straight at her. Evelyn screamed as the figure enveloped her, wrapping itself around her body. She felt a searing pain as it entered her mind, filling her with visions of violence and terror. She struggled to break free, but it was too late. The spirit had taken possession of her body. In the days that followed, Evelyn's friends and family noticed that something was wrong. She was distant and cold, and she seemed to be obsessed with the occult. She would spend hours in her room, chanting strange incantations and performing bizarre rituals. And then one day, she disappeared without a trace. The police searched for her, but they found no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. But some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice. Whispers in the darkness, calling out for help, begging to be released from the grip of the malevolent spirit that had possessed her. And some say that if you look closely, you can see a faint outline of a human figure hovering in the air, just like the one that had come out of the shattered remains of the haunted phone. The legend of the possessed phone lived on, and many who heard the story felt a chill run down their spine. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a spooky tale, while others believed it to be true. And no matter what they believed, one thing was certain: the haunted phone would continue to haunt the imaginations of those who dared to explore the dark side of the supernatural. The Abandoned Asylum. The Abandoned Asylum had always been a place of fascination for the people of the small town that surrounded it. For years, the crumbling building had stood silent, its boarded-up windows and decaying facade serving as a stark reminder of the dark history that had taken place within its walls. And yet, despite the rumors of ghosts and unspeakable horrors that lingered there, a small group of teenagers couldn't resist the temptation to explore the abandoned asylum for themselves. One summer evening, they gathered outside the rusted gates that surrounded the property. They had come armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of adventure that bordered on reckless. They climbed over the fence and made their way towards the main entrance, taking care to avoid the broken glass and debris that littered the ground. The interior of the asylum was even more eerie than they had imagined. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay, and the walls were covered in peeling paint and rusted metal fixtures. They moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing off the walls. As they explored the upper floors of the building, they began to notice strange markings on the walls. Symbols that they couldn't identify, etched into the plaster in what appeared to be blood. And as they descended deeper into the bowels of the asylum, they heard whispers and murmurs that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. The group's bravado began to waver as the night wore on. They started to feel as though they were being watched, and the sense of malevolence that hung in the air was palpable. But still they pushed on, driven by a desire to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within the asylum's walls. It wasn't until they reached the basement that things truly began to unravel. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were lined with rusted metal cages that looked like they had been used to house patients. And then, as they rounded a corner, they saw something that froze them in their tracks. A figure, hunched over in the darkness. Its skin was gray and mottled, its eyes sunken and lifeless. And as it turned to face them, they saw that its mouth was stretched into a rictus grin, revealing a mouthful of jagged, yellow teeth. The teenagers screamed and ran, tearing through the corridors of the asylum in a desperate bid to escape. They could hear the creature's footsteps behind them, its ragged breaths hot on their heels. And just when they thought they were free, they found themselves face to face with another horror. A room filled with medical equipment, crude surgical instruments that looked like they had been cobbled together from scrap metal. And in the center of the room, a gurney with straps that looked as though they had been designed to hold a person in place. The teenagers tried to flee, but they found that they were trapped. The asylum seemed to have a will of its own, and it was determined to keep them there, to subject them to the same horrors that had claimed so many before them. And in the end, they were never seen again. Their families searched for them, the police combed the surrounding woods, but no trace of them was ever found. Some said that they had been consumed by the darkness that haunted the abandoned asylum, while others whispered of a more sinister fate. But one thing was certain, the asylum still stood, its dark secrets buried within its crumbling walls. And as the years passed, the people of the small town that surrounded it continued to steer clear of the abandoned asylum, content to let the ghosts of the past remain undisturbed. That was it for this video. See you next time.